When analyzing the threat quantum computing poses to Bitcoin, the prevailing assumption across the industry is that developers will coordinate a reactive soft fork once quantum hardware comes online, swapping out the vulnerable cryptography and moving on. That strategy assumes the transition is purely a software issue. It ignores the physical realities of migrating an entire global distributed system over a constrained peer-to-peer network. Furthermore, the quantum threat against Bitcoin operates on two distinct parallel tracks. It targets the authorization layer, where digital signatures approve spending, and it separately targets the consensus layer, where mining hardware secures the ledger. Fixing the authorization layer with new cryptographic standards requires pushing massive amounts of new data to the chain. Transitioning to quantum resistance is a rigid block space logistics problem. Waiting for the adversary's hardware to mature makes a secure migration physically impossible. Two mathematical constraints define this logistical bottleneck. The first governs the attacker's capability, the just-in-time or JIT execution window. Under realistic near-term quantum parameters, a vulnerable private key can be cracked in approximately 66 seconds. The second metric governs the network's defense. Migrating the currently exposed unspent transaction outputs, or UTXOs, to quantum-safe formats requires a minimum of 76 days of uninterrupted maximum capacity block space. These two figures represent absolute physical boundaries. The network cannot operate faster than its 1 megabyte block limit, and the cryptographic math cannot be solved faster than the logical gate rate of the attacking machine. Securing the network requires engineering a migration framework that successfully threads the needle between a 66-second theft vulnerability and a 2.5-month data transfer bottleneck. The authorization attack surface specifically targets funds where the public key is already exposed on-chain. This includes legacy pay-to-public key outputs, reused pay-to-public key hash addresses, and first-use Taproot key paths. A user broadcasts a transaction, exposing their public key. Applying Shor's algorithm, a quantum computer recovers the private key in roughly 66 seconds. The network operates on a 600-second block interval. Subtracting the 66-second recovery time reveals a glaring discrepancy. The adversary has nearly 9 clear minutes to construct a competing transaction spending the same UTXO, attach a higher miner fee, and broadcast it. The malicious spend is included in the next block, and the funds are stolen before the legitimate user's transaction ever settles. The cryptographically sound response is to implement the National Institute of Standards and Technology's post-quantum algorithms. Specifically, FIPS 204, known as ML-DSA, and FIPS 205, SLH-DSA, offer standardized replacements for current signature schemes. A standard signature occupies 64 bytes of block space. The most compact post-quantum option, ML-DSA 44, requires 2,420 bytes. When applied to a standard transaction, the total data footprint scales from 250 bytes to approximately 5,200 bytes. This is a 20.8 times increase. Because miners prioritize transactions based on fee per byte density, users must pay for this inflation. At a standard rate of 50 satoshis per byte, the cost of a routine transaction jumps to severe, prohibitive levels. Hardening the cryptography secures the individual UTXO, but universally deploying these signatures immediately chokes the 1 megabyte block limit, degrading the utility of the entire network. To understand the system-wide impact, we must measure the total exposed surface area. Current network analysis estimates there are 1.2 billion UTXOs with exposed public keys vulnerable to the JIT attack. This chart graphs the lower bound time required to transition all 1.2 billion vulnerable outputs. The formula incorporates the 1 megabyte limit, 10-minute block intervals, and an overhead factor of 1.2. Assuming blocks are 100% dedicated to post-quantum signatures, it requires 76.16 straight days. If the ecosystem were to universally pre-adopt Taproot, the protocol's 36% witness data discounting would reduce this burden. But even under those perfectly optimized conditions, the migration time only drops to 54.45 days. The mathematics are definitive. Upgrading the network takes nearly 2 months of dedicated throughput. An emergency, last-minute patch in response to a live quantum threat is physically impossible. Processing the massive signature migration resolves the authorization threat, but it ignores the raw computational engine securing the ledger. The proof-of-work consensus remains fully exposed. A quantum attacker utilizing Grover's algorithm achieves a quadratic speedup against SHA-256, drastically reducing the time required to find valid nonces. This threat is asymptotic. As classical difficulty increases, the mathematical advantage becomes aggressively more dominant, outpacing the entire classical network. Successfully executing the 76-day signature migration stops the theft of individual UTXOs, but leaves the underlying consensus layer entirely vulnerable to a quantum 51% attack. This infographic details a rigid 9-phase migration roadmap designed to optimize network logistics before quantum hardware scales. Phase 5 requires immediate preemptive action, maximizing the current adoption of Taproot and Shor signatures to compress existing data footprints. Upgrading standard operations to Taproot now frees up approximately 300 gigabytes of block space per year. This architectural efficiency is the only physical mechanism capable of absorbing the incoming data inflation of post-quantum cryptography. In a system strictly bound by bandwidth, protocol efficiency directly dictates protocol security. The network must be hollowed out and optimized well before the new signatures are deployed. Phase 6 executes a voluntary dual-stack migration. Mirroring the multi-year SegWit rollout, wallets will generate and nodes will accept both legacy ECDSA and new post-quantum signatures side by side. This requires high-level coordination from infrastructure providers. Exchanges, node operators, and hardware wallets must be standardized to process the inflated transaction sizes without fragmenting the network consensus. The roadmap culminates in Phase 7, targeted triage, prioritizing the migration of legacy scripts, reused addresses, and hot wallets. Securing these specific UTXOs immediately neutralizes the highest probability attack vectors, protecting the most vulnerable value early in the 76-day window. A mathematically perfect signature has zero value if it cannot fit within its physical bandwidth constraints. To successfully secure the ledger, ecosystem alignment and rigid policy migration must systematically outpace the arrival of quantum hardware.